62b. 4 lines from the bottom. Tanya was taught in a brisa. Acherim Ayrim. Others say, in a Mishnah that's clearly Reb Meir. We've had before that in a brisa it's not necessarily Reb Meir, but our Gemara is going to learn that it's necessarily Reb Meir. And it's clear that it's Reb Meir as well. Acherim, others say, Hikdim mulin la'arelim. If the person slaughtering the sacrifice has intention that this sacrifice is being slaughtered, the Korban Pesach is being slaughtered for people that had a bris and for people that didn't have a bris. Right. Now, those two intentions, which one came first? The circumcised ones came first. That was his first intention. So kosher, the sacrifice is kosher. Arelim lemulim, let's say it was the other way. He has intention first for the uncircumcised, and then he has intention for the circumcised. So then it's puzzle. It's invalid. That's the statement of Acherim. The Gemara asks, why is it kosher if the thoughts of the circumcised participants came first? The kula arla beinan baleka. It's only because it's only invalid if there's no one here that's circumcised. But if you have even one person that's circumcised, then it becomes valid because of that person. It needs to be kula arelim for it to be invalid. It needs to be entirely uncircumcised, and you don't have that. So if that's the case, and that's why you said it's kosher, ikdim mulim la'arelim, so then why the other way? Arelim l'mulim nami kula arla baleka. Either way you do it, you don't have entirely a group of people that's uncircumcised. So why is one way kosher, one way not kosher? At least in all of our understanding, that's always how it was. That you needed to have the entire group to be invalid for it to be invalid. But if you had individuals there that were acceptable, that were circumcised, then the sacrifice was good. Why over here are we saying it depends which thoughts came first? So we're on top of Samach Gimel now. The Gemara suggests, Lema Kasavri Acherim, maybe Acherim holds, that's Reb Meir, Eina l'shchita l'b'sayf. It's a machlekes we had in other places. How shchita works. Do we say that the shchita is one long process? Or do we say that all of that long process, the whole slaughtering, you have to shech two pipes on an animal? Do you say, I forget an animal or a bird. One is one and one is two. So do we say that it's the whole slaughtering is the shchita, and thoughts that happen throughout is the whole time making it invalid or valid? Or do we say that the shchita only takes effect at the very end? All of that is just preliminary activities that lead up to the end. Now, if that's the case, that everything just leads up to the end, and then the end, that's when it takes effect, which is what we're saying here, then any thoughts that take place beforehand are all like gathered together and imposed on that last moment. Now, what that means is that the shechita itself is not divided up into two segments. The first beginning of the shechita, the end of the shechita, it's all one slot. Now, let's go jump further, then we'll go through what Rashi throws in here. Rashi gives us some background. We'll see how it's going to work. Look at the Rava. And we also need to follow the opinion of Rava. So we need to follow, the first thing is that shchita only takes effect at the end. And then we also have to accept Rava that says, Adayin hi machlokes. Rava adayin hi machlokes. It's still an argument. Okay. What's happening here is that we had several times a machlokes Reb Meir and Reb Yosi regarding if two statements were made. If someone says by a sacrifice, Harezu tmuras oila tmuras shlamim. Tmura is an exchange of a sacrifice for another sacrifice. Now, the law is by tmura that when you try to exchange a sacrifice, it becomes that both of them become holy. So let's say it's a violation, but they both become holy. They both become sacrifices. Let's say the person says, Harezu Tmuras Ayla. Okay, so this sacrifice now becomes an Ayla. Harezu Tmuras Shlamim, then the sacrifice would become a Shlamim. But let's say he says both. Harezu Tmuras Ayla, Tmuras Shlamim. This sacrifice should be an Ayla and a Shlamim. He doesn't say the word and. This is a sacrifice should be an Ayla, the sacrifice should be a Shlamim. So then, it's Machlekes Rav Meir and Rav Yossi. Rav Meir says, Tafas Lashon Rishon. Whatever he said first. Okay, now that's what we're viewing right now because we're dealing with the Acherim, that we say Tafas Lashon Rishon, you take the one that's first. Okay, we're not done yet. We're still in the middle of the discussion there. So Tafas Lashon Rishon, you take the one that's first, which means that Harisa Tumar Seilah Tumar Shlamim, this sacrifice becomes an island. However, Rabbi Yossi holds different. Rabbi Yossi holds that it becomes an oila and the shlamim af bigmar dvarav adam nitvas, and you would have to wait for the sacrifice to get a mum, and then sell it, and then buy two other karbanos. The Gemara is a question. This is not by us. This is probably it's in Zvachim. The Gemara is a question there. It says, let's say the person says, chetzia oila v'chetzia shlamim. Half of this should be an oila, half should be a shlamim. The Gemara doesn't know what Reb Meir would hold in that instance, because the question is: does Reb Meir say that we don't let you retract when you said Harizu Tumar Seilah Tumar Shlamim? That's a sort of retraction, and you say there's no retraction. You said Tumar Seilah, that's it; it's an island. Or do we say, and what would come out from that if Reb Meir says we don't let you retract? That would mean that if I say chetzia oila, chetzia shlamim, then there's no retraction. Then it should be half and half. Or in other words, Reb Meir would agree with Reb Yossi. Or do we say that that's not the pshat? We say that once you said oila, the oila spreads out to the whole thing, and the whole thing becomes an oila and finished. Even though you said chetzia oila, we say that nispashet bekula and it becomes an oila. And even though you only said half should be an oila, it's too late. You said half should be oila, the whole thing becomes an oila, and that's it. And you finished Tumar Shlam, Chetzia Shlamim, Tumar Shlamim, it doesn't matter. Now, that's the other option over here. So you have two options. Is there a machlekes if you clearly said Chetzia? Okay, so it's a machlekes Abaye and Rava. Rava says Adayani machlekes, that even if you said Chetzia oila, it's still a machlekes between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi, and Reb Meir would hold that it's only an oila, the Tafas Lashon Rishon, except the first statement. I'm not done yet in this commentary. So then Rava has a question to Abaye. Rashi quotes this question. He says, if someone slaughters a sacrifice and he has intention to eat the kazayas bachutz and the kazayas lamacha, one olive size of the meat is going to be outside the allotted location, and one is going to be outside the allotted time, out of the allotted time. Now, pigul is out of the allotted time. So Rava says that there's a machlekes between Rava. This is Rava's question to Abaye. He says that there's a machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. And Rabbi Yehuda holds like Reb Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that when he says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Tafas Lashon Rishon. And because the Zman came first, the Chutz came before the Zman, so therefore, it's not going to be pigul. But if the Zman came first, then it would be pigul. So in other words, we've mentioned once before that when it comes to pigul, it needs to be either entirely pigul or entirely valid, except for the one thought of pigul. That doesn't fit with Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Meir in this case. Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say that it could become pigul even if it's not entirely. What we were saying before when we mentioned that was the opinion of the Rabbanan, that say it needs to be, you can't have any other invalidation or else it ruins it from being pigul, or else it protects it from being pigul. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir hold differently. They hold that whichever one comes first, it's going to be pigul. Now, if that's the case, Rava's question to Abaye is, take a look over here. I have a zayas of one thought. I have a zayas of another thought, right? A kizayas. I'm going to eat it. And we say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we only take the first one. Now, if that's the case, then if I should say chetzia oila chetzia shlam, we're comparing here. Chetzia oila chetzia shlamim, Abaye said that Reb Meir would agree to the Rabbanan that I don't say tafas lashon rishon, but over here when it's chatzi zayis and a chatzi zayis, I do say tafas lashon rishon. So Rava's claim is that when it is possible that he meant both, because you could divide it up, I still say that I only take the first statement. Okay, so based on that, on this question, Abaye answers. And he says that we're talking about that the shechita itself takes an extended period of time. And the reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds that it becomes either pigul or not pigul based on the first thought, that's because he holds that the beginning of the shechita already is enough of an action that the animal becomes puzzle or pigul just from that action. So in other words, in the shechita itself, I have two parts to the shechita: the beginning, cutting the first pipe, and cutting the second pipe. So it will already become pigul by the first one. And Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda hold that I don't say that I need the entire shechita to be pigul. They hold that whatever happens first is it. So that's the opinion of Abaye. That's how Abaye answers. And Rava holds that's not so. Rava says the shechita is all at the end. And so therefore Rava has this question. It must be that we say tafas lashon rishon even when both of them could have taken place. Back to us. The guy the sheikhet has a thought that it's lamula mula arelim for circumcised and not circumcised. So we're explaining here that really tafas lashon rishon, we only take the first thought, and yeshna l'shchita eno l'shchita al b'sayf. It's only at the end, and so therefore, whatever he thinks of first, that's the whole thing. Hilka on the third line. Hiktem mulam la'arelim. What I was explaining to you was this nice long Rashi that takes up half the page. Hiktem mulam la'arelim. If his first thought is the circumcised, and his second thought is the uncircumcised, then mulan chayli arelim lechayli. It takes over. It's all that happened here was he had thoughts about the circumcised, and therefore the sacrifice is kosher. Hiktem arelim lemulam arelim chayli mulan lechayli. If his thoughts are for the uncircumcised first, then it's going to be puzzle. Okay. And basically, what the Gemara did here, in summary, is that if I would have said that the shechita is a longer process, then I could have divided it up into different thoughts, and they all would have taken effect. But because I said that the shechita only takes place at one moment, at the final moment, then you can only grasp one thought there, and that's going to be the whole thought. Amar Rava or Rabba, it's two versions of the Gemara. It says light. That's not the pshat of it. And we're talking about achirim. Why there's a difference if he has thoughts of arelim first or thoughts of mulim first, circumcised or uncircumcised, and that's going to be the validity of the on that is dependent if the Korban Pesach is valid. Really, achirim, which is Reb Meir holds yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'ad seif, that the shchita was a long process and it could be divided up. It's first at the beginning of it, he thought this, the end. So then, why is it not valid? His intention was that he's going to slaughter this Korban Pesach for both circumcised and uncircumcised. He has a whole list of people, and he's slaughtering it, and he has them in mind. Bein lemulam, bein la'arelim, for both circumcised and uncircumcised. V'haitzi bepiv la'arelim, v'lahispek leimer lemulam, ad shenikmer shtita ba'arelim. He's trying to say it while he's doing the shechita, but while he's saying it, the shechita is all over, and he only got out of his mouth the arelim, and he didn't get a chance to say the mulam yet, and the shechita is already over. They were like sort of like slowed down by the Chabad Kaddish by Mincha on Shabbos. You got to get the Torah back before the Kaddish is over. Here, so he's trying to pronounce who's the sacrifice for, but he finished the shechita already. It's him himself. He finished the shechita. And here's what's going on. There are Meir Sever Leibin and Piv Shavin. Reb Meir holds that we don't look at what's in his heart. We look at what's in his mouth, what he said. And even though his heart was different, was more inclusive than what he said, that's okay. That doesn't affect what he said. What he said is still valid. But Rabbanan Sabri bin Piv Shavin. Rabbanan say no. Rabbanan say that what he said is different than what he said in his heart. It doesn't invalidate the sacrifice. Rashi over here says, what's going on? What is this? We have thoughts and speech. Rashi says, from here, it's clear that everything that's, Taisus also quotes the Kan Medak decree, that when we say a psul b'machshava, we're only talking about speech. It has to be pronounced. Whenever we say that the Kayan had the wrong thought, it always means that he had the wrong pronouncement. That's what it means, the thought. His machshava means that he pronounced, he was saying. The Rashi's more than that. Not just we only know his machshava because he spoke it out. If he had thoughts and he didn't speak it out, it's nothing. Not just how do we know? I hear. But that's a proof. That's a proof. What Rashi is saying is that when we say that he had a thought that invalidates the sacrifice, we actually mean that he pronounced it. We mentioned once that the Rebbe and his father had an argument about what Rashi really holds. Clearly regarding Truma. The Rebbe held that thought was powerful enough. And things actually, when it comes to Truma, it says that you can designate Truma in thought. The Rebbe held that the thought actually sanctifies it, according to Rashi. And the Rebbe's father said that's not the pshat in Rashi. You designate it, but it's not sanctified. No, it's considered separated, but not sanctified until it's pronounced. And there's letters back and forth, but the Rebbe's father was very sharp with the Rebbe, and he says, you didn't learn it well enough. Look it over again. You'll see that that's not what Rashi means. Look in the Sharamela, you'll see whatever. And the Rebbe's quoting something from Torah, from Lakutei Torah, that he's proving what Rashi means. And apparently, even after the Rebbe got the letters from his father, he still held that he was correct. And we have a letter later where the Rebbe has like 4 levels of the power of thought. One of the early letters of the Rebbe. And he ignores his father's comments. Anyway, over here, Rashi seems to be telling us that it's the speech. Now, what's happening here is Reb Meir holds loy ba'in on pivali b'shabun, which means we look at his speech. Even though we look at his speech, even though in his heart he was saying more than that, but we look at the speech. And the Rabbanan say that we look at his heart as well. We look at what he had in his heart, what his intention was. And so therefore, because he had intention for both, even though during the Shechita he only had a chance to say one of them, let's say la'arelim, for the uncircumcised, we still say that we follow what he had in his heart. The Gemara asks now, Reb Meir actually holds that you don't have to have the speech equal to what's in his heart, and if his speech is not equal to in his heart, then we disregard it. We don't say that. But Raminu, we have a question, a contradiction. If a person had intention to say this item should be truma, but he said the wrong thing. He said this item is meiser. Meiser v'amar truma are the opposite. He had intention that this should be meiser, and instead he said it's truma. He makes a vow. I'm not going to go into this house. And instead, and when he says this, he points to the wrong thing, or he says the opposite house. That I won't have benefit from this person. And he says the other person. So it's nothing until what he says, what he expresses, and what he was thinking is exactly the same. So Reb Meir holds that it doesn't matter what he was saying; it only matters what he was thinking. And here you're telling me that it matters what he's saying and not what he's thinking. So it's a contradiction in the words of Reb Meir. Yitzia, you locked out? Is the door locked downstairs? Oh no, you're driving. Okay. Elamar Abaya says in Anupshat. Reisha Damar Simin Rishon Lemulan Simin Sheni Af Larelim. Simin Sheni Nambi Psicha Bein Mulan. Sefer Damar Simin Rishon Larelim Simin Sheni Lemulan the Simin Rishon Ale Psicha Bein Mulan. Rab Meir Tamei Damar Pagam B'Chatzi Mater Ram Tamei Damar Pagam B'Chatzi Mater. We throw in another for the whole story over here. We're talking about the concept of mifaglin b'chatzi amater. Can something become pigel? Oh wow, Yitzis have to oil. Have us in mind. Mifaglin b'chatzi amater. We're talking about now if a sacrifice could become pigel if there are two parts to the matir. Matir means what makes the sacrifice valid. So, for example, let's say the offering of the scoopful of a mincha on the fire and the offering of the levina on the fire. Both of those are significant in making a korban mincha into a valid sacrifice. If you have thoughts of pigel by one of them, but not by the other one, Reb Meir holds it becomes pigel. So,
isn't pigel by 9?
Pigel is when you have thoughts of doing something for the sacrifice out of the allotted time. So by a korban mincha, it would be that you're going to eat it out of the allotted time. By a sacrifice, it could be I'm going to eat it or sprinkle the blood out of the allotted time or something. Now, what we're saying over here is that the shechita has two parts to it. The first part of the shechita, you have to slaughter the esophagus and the windpipe and the food pipe. So he slaughters the windpipe, and he says, this is the beginning of Acherim's words. He says, this is for the people that have a circumcision. When it comes to the second pipe, the second part of the slaughtering, he says this is for people that are uncircumcised. Now, when he says for the uncircumcised, he actually has intention for both. Also for the uncircumcised. So there was no part of this that was invalid. The first part of the shechita was good; it was for the circumcised, and the second part of the shechita was good. In the second case, he says the first part of the shechita is for the uncircumcised, and the second part of the shechita was for the circumcised. Shouldn't Reb Meir hold Tachas Lashon Rishon? No, because we're dividing it up. We're not saying that we're looking at the first statement here. What we're saying is we're looking at each part of the shechita as being half a mater. And if any half of this is invalid, so then the whole carbon becomes invalid. So what we're saying is that if he has intention for half of the shechita to be just for the uncircumcised, then that would invalidate the sacrifice. So the first part of the shechita is strictly for one type, circumcised or uncircumcised. So the beginning of Acherim's statement was mulim was first, so it was strictly for mulim. The second part of the shechita was for both. That's a good sacrifice because he never had any part of that shechita that was strictly for uncircumcised. The second part of that brisa was arelim, the first part of the shechita was strictly for the uncircumcised, and that automatically the sacrifice is already invalid because mefagum b'chatzi amater. He holds that even part of a mater could create an entire, could invalidate the whole sacrifice. Okay, what we did here was an attempt to explain an opinion of Acherim that it's possible for a Korban Pesach to be invalid when there's a mixture of circumcised and uncircumcised, depending on which one was first. At the beginning of it, we attempted to say that it had to do with Reb Meir's opinion of Tafas Lashon Rishon. You grabbed your first statement. Rabba then says that no, it has to do with Piva Levi Shavin. If he had an intention for more than what he expressed. And now Abaya says that it has to do with Mefaglim B'chatzi Amater, that it has to do with if different parts of this shechita were different intentions. And we say that even if part of the shechita had a strictly invalid intention, do we say that the whole sacrifice is invalid? Okay, complications. And we have a new Mishnah. It's a little easier. The new Mishnah goes like this. Someone shechs the Korban Pesach, and he still has chametz. Now we're talking about the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon. The chametz is still around. He violates a negative prohibition, which says, don't slaughter my sacrifice. It actually says it twice. Don't slaughter my sacrifice on chametz. And which means that if there's chametz still there, there's a prohibition. Rabbi Yehuda says that it's actually referring to, when it says zivchi, dam zivchi, it's also referring to the carbon tamid, which is brought that afternoon as well. So the one that slaughters the tamid also violates. If that person still has chametz, it's also a violation. Not only if the carbon pesach, the owner of that carbon pesach, or the sheichet has chametz, it's a violation, but also the carbon tamid on Erev Pesach in the afternoon, also there's a violation that there can't be chametz around. Now, there's a violation to own chametz. Is there a negative violation as well when he slaughters the carbon Pesach? Reb Shimon says, Pesach ba'arba asar. Depends. Shimon says like this. Reb Shimon is a little confusing because it's slightly counterintuitive what's going to come out. He says on the 14th, if someone slaughters a carbon Pesach, l'shmai is chayiv, v'shalei l'shmai is pater. If the carbon Pesach is valid and he has chametz, then he violated shechting the carbon Pesach with chametz. So far, so good. That makes sense. If the carbon Pesach is not valid, because he had thoughts of Shalei Lishma, then he's exempt. Why? Because he didn't check the Korban Pesach with chametz. The Korban Pesach wasn't valid. Okay, so far so good. B'shar kol hazvachim, when it comes to all other sacrifices on Erev Pesach, bein Lishman, bein Shalei Lishman is pater. Whether they were shechted valid or not valid, Lishman or Shalei Lishman, he's exempt. So he clearly doesn't hold up Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said that even the Tamid on Erev Pesach was a violation. Rabbi Shimon says on Erev Pesach, it's only the carbon Pesach. That's a violation if there's still chametz. ubemayit, but let's say on Pesach itself, lishmai, if he shechts a sacrifice on Pesach with intention, let's say it was a shlamim, or let's say it's a carbon Pesach even, but he shechts it as a carbon Pesach, then he's pater. Why? Because that sacrifice is not valid. He's shechting a carbon Pesach on Pesach. Carbon Pesach needs to be shechted on Erev Pesach. So the sacrifice isn't valid. So the fact that he has chametz there is not a violation of shechting a carbon Pesach with chametz, because it's not a carbon Pesach. The whole thing is invalid. Shaloi l'shmai. But if he shechted as a shlamim, and it's on Pesach, and he has chametz, so we only did one thing wrong. That's he has chametz on Pesach while he's shechting a separate carbon, then he's chayav. He's chayav because he shechted a carbon on Pesach while he still has chametz. Now, if it was Erev Pesach, if it's on Erev Pesach, he wouldn't be chayav for those sacrifices. And on Pesach, he is chayav. The Gemara is going to explain that you're only chayav for one thing. Reb Shimon is sort of like exclusive here. On Erev Pesach, that pasuk is referring only to the carbon Pesach. On Pesach, when the carbon Pesach can't be shechted, it's referring to all other karbanos. Yeah, he violates. Let me explain. Avram Nassan's asking. He has chametz anyway, so what's the difference? It's a violation of owning chametz. The question is, does he get malchus? You can't get malchus for owning chametz because there's no action there. But if you shech the carbon that you did an action and you had chametz, that would be a prohibition of that would incur malchus. So there is a difference what the prohibition here is. Is it shechting a carbon having chametz, or is it just owning chametz? Nothing. Eating chametz is kares. I think so. B'shar kol hazvachim, when it comes to all other sacrifices, bein lishman, bein shalei lishman is chayev. We're talking about on. I have to read this again. On Yom Tiv, lishmai pater shalei lishmai was chayev. That was talking about the carbon Pesach. Any other sacrifices, for example, a carbon shlamim, then you see the rule is that a carbon shlamim, even if it's shechted shalei lishmai, if it's shechted for a different sacrifice, it's still kosher. So therefore, even if you shechted a carbon shlamim on Pesach and you had intention for it to be a carbon Pesach, which really is the wrong time because carbon Pesach was only on Erev Pesach. So, but because the sacrifice is still valid, there's a prohibition there. If he owns chametz, that he shechted a shlamim, which is still valid, even though he had intention for it to be a carbon Pesach, but he shechted a shlamim with chametz there. And Reb Shimon holds that on Pesach itself, that's the prohibition of don't slaughter a sacrifice with chametz. There is an exception because a chatas is a type of sacrifice that if you intend for it to be a different sacrifice, the whole sacrifice is invalid. So therefore, based on our logic, that if the sacrifice is invalid and you had chametz, you didn't shech the sacrifice with chametz because the sacrifice was invalid. Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish, the Gemara says, Reb Shimon ben Lakish explains, Laila min achai vet sheyach chametz l'shoichet el l'zoyrech. Elechem me'achabura. We're talking about someone here owns chametz. In the prohibition, I'm not sure if the prohibition is strictly on the shoichet. And if the shoichet owns chametz, then he's clearly chayev. If the one that's sprinkling the blood owns chametz and he sprinkles the blood, he's also chayev. If one of the people in the chabura, one of the group own chametz, then someone over here is chayev. The shoichet and the zayrek, or the guy in the chabura that owns the chametz. I'm not sure exactly how it works though. If one of the chabura owns the chametz, who exactly is chayev? The shoichet The sheichet's chayiv because someone else owned chametz. I guess so. Vad sheyeh imei ba'azara. But he needs to be there. He needs to be there. And I think the chametz needs to be there, according to this Gemara, in the azara. Yeah. The chametz needs to be there in the azara. When we're talking about the bnei chabur, of course the sheichet is in the azara. And the zayrek is, of course, in the azara. But what about the chametz or the bnei chabura that has the chametz? I guess it's just referring to the chametz. The chametz needs to be in the azara with the sheichet, with the zayrek, or with the bnei chabura. That's according to Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says, "Leisishchat al chametz." Don't slaughter on chametz. Now, the word al, which we translate usually as on, over here means next to, according to Rish Lakish. Va'alav mate Menashe. Rashi quotes the pasuk. And next to him is the tribe of Menashe. Rabbi Yechanan says, Rabbi Yechanan says he's chayiv even if the chametz isn't there in the azara. But my kamiflagi, what's the machlekes Rabbi Yechanan Rish Lakish? It's a machlekes in the Hebrew language. Let's say the machlekes is what the word al means. Does al, when it says al, which we translate in Hebrew as on, does it mean next to? The Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish sabar al b'samach. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that it means next to. Rabbi Yechanan sabar lei being an al b'samach. Rabbi Yechanan says yechayev even if it's not next to. Yechayev just for owning it. Al doesn't have to be next to. Al means with or together with. And if the person has it, even if it's not in the azara, he's still chayev. The person says, really? That's the machlekes? That's the machlekes Rabbi Yechanan Rish Lakish. They already argued about this. They argued about this somewhere else. They're arguing about it again in the translation of Al. We know that they argue about this. Why? Ditnan, it was taught in the Mishnah. Hasheichet taida lefnim. The next word in my Gemara says v'lachayma. It's supposed to say v'lachma. It's corrected on the side. V'lachma chutz l'chayma. You see, it says, I don't know what you have in the new Gemara over there. You have v'lachma? Oh, okay, good. So they corrected already. In my old Gemara, it says v'lachayma chutz l'chayma. Okay. He slaughters the taida in the correct location, but his bread, the taida, which is a Thanksgiving offering, comes together with 40 loaves of bread. Now, where is the bread located? It's supposed to be in the azara as well. However, if the bread is not in the azara, it's outside the walls. So, like Kiddush Alechem, the bread isn't sanctified. Now, when it says outside the walls, what walls are you talking about? So the pasuk says, Al zevach ha'toida chales, that on the sacrifice of the taida is the chales. Now, when it says on, Rish Lakish, of course, means that it means next to. And Rabbi Yechanan says it doesn't need to be next to. So, my chutz l'chayma, Rabbi Yechanan, chutz l'chayma space pagi. Rabbi Yechanan says it's way out. If it's outside of Yerushalayim, basically, that's going to be invalid. If it's outside the azara, it's fine. It doesn't need to be right next to. Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, even if it's outside the azara, it's not sanctified. Alma bin al basama. Rish Lakish says that al means that it needs to be next to. Translation of the word al. Gemara's question is, why does Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan have to argue about al when it comes to the carbon taida, and they argue about al when it comes to chametz with the carbon pesach? They argued about it once. We would know that they have the same opinion. What does the word al mean? The Gemara says, they must be arguing about something else. The arguing is like this. When you warn someone and you say, don't do it, you're going to get malchus. Now, do you have to know 100% that the person is violating this prohibition? So when the guy is shechting or sprinkling the blood, and he has chametz somewhere else, So you say, don't do it. You may get malchus because the chametz isn't there. So you gave him a warning of a just in case. If the chametz is still existing, it's not here because it's somewhere else. Is that considered a hasra? So Reish Lakish says that hasra suffix is not considered hasra. You need to have the chametz right here, and I have to be able to tell you that don't do it. If you do it, you're going to get malchus with a definite warning. And Rabbi Yechanan says, no, you can even warn him in a way, don't do it, because you may get malchus if the chametz is still there. I know it's not here, but if it's still existing and you own it, it's going to be a problem. And Rabbi Yechanan says that warning over a doubtful warning is also a warning. So, very nice. It's a new machlekes. The Gemara says, no, this is not a new machlekes. You also argued about that somewhere else. The Itmar. It's a statement of Amirayim. You see, if someone takes a vow that I'm not going to do something, then you can warn him while he's doing it and say, don't do it. If you do it, you're going to violate your vow, because he's clearly at that moment violating the vow that he took, the oath that he took, that I'm not going to do it. Now he's doing it. Yeah. He's about to do it. You see him, he says, I'm not going to eat this and that. And you see that he's starting to eat it. So you tell him, you're about to violate it. You're going to get malchus. You're violating the vow that you took, the oath that you took. Now, let's say he takes an oath that I'm going to do something. So then you warn him and you say, I don't see you doing it. You're going to get malchus. So he says, yeah, I'm going to do it a little later. You can never really warn him because you can always say, I'm going to do it later. So he says, I'm going to do it today. I'm going to eat this loaf of bread today. Right? So you warn him. You say, I don't see you eating it. The day's almost over. He says, yeah, there's still a little bit left time. So what's going to happen at the last moment? I don't know. But throughout the day, you can't really warn him. So Rabbi Yechanan Reish Lakish Damri Tavayu ain't like it. Both Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish say that there's no malchus for this case. Why? They agree to the result, but they disagree on the reasoning for it. Rabbi Yechanan Amar ain't like Misham Dav Alav Shein B'Maisa. Rabbi Yechanan says there's no action. When the day passes and he didn't eat the bread that he promised that he was going to eat, that he took the oath that he was going to eat, there's no malchus because it's a lav shein b'maisa. You say he didn't do any action. You only get malchus when you commit the crime, not when you commit it passively. It has to be an active prohibition. Here it was just passive. He didn't eat, so we violated. V'chol lav shein b'maisa ain't like an alav. If it's just committed in a passive fashion, there's no malchus. Aval asra safik shmei asra. But the warning has no problem with it. The warning was fine. Say, I want to warn you, you may end up violating it if the day passes and you don't eat it. So I'm warning him right now that you may end up violating it. Reb Shimon Lakish says differently. He says, Ain't like him Shem Davali Asra Safek. Shimon Lakish says the reason why he's not concerned about the passive act, that you're violating it in a passive way. He's concerned that you can never actually warn him in a definite manner. You're always warning him, you may end up violating it if you don't eat it. Both of them said that there's no malchus here. Rabbi Yechanan says there's no malchus because it's a lav shein b'maisa. Reish Lakish says there's no malchus because you can never really warn him. No, when you're not going to do something, then he goes ahead and he does it. Then he's while he's doing the act, and while he's about to do it, then when I warn him, there's two things over there. First of all, he's about to commit the crime in an active manner, and he's also doing it right now. I can warn him right now, don't do it. Yeah, that's because the chametz was in a different location. But if the chametz is here, right here, and I'm looking at the chametz, it says, Cheerios or whatever. No, what do you mean? If it's right here, it's definite.
Not here, but not
If it's not here, they're right. So that was the first way of explaining, and we had a problem with that because they argued about that somewhere else. So that we don't want that to be the machlekes.
The actual concept of being able to do not definite form.
Correct. If it's not a definite warning, so then it's machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Right. Now we're saying that that they argue about a not definite warning somewhere else. So we're saying so that probably isn't the machlekes by chametz because they argued about it by a neder by hasra safek. Avalav shem b'maisa leikenlav. According to Rish Lakish, you get malchus for alav shem b'maisa. The Gemara says Amri. They said like this: La'olam ba'al b'samach kamiflagi. Actually, they're arguing about the translation of al. We said, well, that they argued about once previously, so why should they argue about that again? So utzricha. That's cute. This line has. Can we have fewer passive aggressive notices here, please? So utzricha, and it's necessary to have it by both. The yifligu le'inyan chametz hava mina bahu dekam Rabbi Yochanan leibin al b'samach shem de'isru v'chol heicha de'isa isa. Aval inyan makdish lechem le'kadosh al b'fnim meidele shem ben lakish de'bin al b'samach isa gavai kadosh v'ilai like kadosh midahavi aklisharis. What's happening is like this. We have two machlekes in between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. What the meaning of the word al means. We have it by chametz. And then we also have it by the carbon taida. Now the carbon taida is slightly different because the carbon taida is the bread is supposed to be sanctified in a klisharis. Now in a klisharis means that it needs to be placed inside the vessel. So I could have thought like this, that Rabbi Yochanan says al doesn't need to be besama. Al doesn't need to be next to by chametz. But by the bread, it does need to be next to, just like the bread needs to be in a klisharis, in a vessel, which needs to be inside. So therefore, it also needs to be inside the azara. Over there, al does mean besama, because it's similar to the klisharis. So again, it would go like this. If they would argue about chametz, so hava mina, bahu dekam Rabbi Yochanan leibin al besama, he says, mishum de'isru, there's a prohibition. Wherever that chametz is, you violate it. It doesn't need to be right next to it. It's a violation. We're not discussing asra safek. We're discussing when it says l'shishchat al chametz. It shouldn't next to the chametz. Doesn't mean next to. It means on wherever it is. It's a violation. But to sanctify the bread, like kadosh el b'fnim, Rabbi Yochanan over there clearly holds that it's only inside. He would hold like Reb Shimon ben Lakish that says it needs to be totally inside. That Reb Shimon ben Lakish clearly holds that, and Rabbi Yochanan would agree to him. If it's inside, Kaddish, then good. If it's inside the walls of the Azara, like Kaddish. If it's outside the walls of the Azara, no. Just like the Klisharis, that it needs to be inside the Klisharis to be sanctified, the bread also needs to be inside the Azara. So that's why we have to mention that they argue about the word al when it comes to lachmi taida. Rabbi Yochanan possibly would agree to Rish Lakish by the lachmi taida. So I need to have a clear statement that he argues with him. Now that's only one side, because what about the other way? If I would actually have the brisa about the carbon taida, okay, we have a clear machlaikas over there. Maybe over there, that's when Rish Lakish holds that al means that it needs to be next to. That means it needs to be inside the azara. Only if the bread is inside, it's sanctified, but not, then it's not sanctified, which is where he argues with Rabbi Yochanan. Aval inyan chametz, when it comes to chametz, maybe Rish Lakish would agree to Rabbi Yochanan. It doesn't need to be inside. Doesn't need to be. The chametz doesn't need to be there. Bisuru v'chol hechadisi. So wherever it is, it's going to be fine. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan always holds that al is not the sama. Al could be wherever it is. That means both by the chametz, it could be in the guy's house, and by the carbon tide, it could be anywhere in Yerushalayim. The breads, and the loaves. And Reish Lakish holds al needs to be right there. Al needs to be in the azara by the bread, and it needs to be in the azara by the chametz. And if it would have only told me by one of those cases, I would have said that each one agrees to the other one. It's necessary. Okay. So we had an attempt by the Gemara to say that the machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding if the chametz needs to be in the azara is a machlekes regarding hasra safek. We said no. We go back to our first explanation that it has to do with a translation of the pasuk al. When it says l'sischad al chametz, doesn't need to be in the azara, or even outside the azara is also, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is also the prohibition. Ba'i minei Rabbi Ishia mi Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ishia asks Rabbi Ami a question. Ein leila sheichet, v'yesh leilachen mechabura mahu. The sheichet doesn't have chametz, but one of the chabura has chametz. Now, we said before this was a machlekes. Rashi explains that what Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, or what Reish Lakish said clearly, wasn't so clear to Rabbi Ishia, or Rabami, to Rabami. Rabbi Ishia asks Rabami. It wasn't so clear to Rabbi Ishia. Ein leila sheichet, v'yesh leilachem nechabura. The sheichet doesn't have the chametz, but someone else in the group does. Mahu, what's the din? Amar lei, Rabami responds, Miksiv le'sishchad al chemtzecha. Does it say, don't shech the Karban Pesach on your chametz? Does it say specifically it needs to be the sheichet? Le'sishchad al chametz ksiv. It doesn't have the possessive pronoun. It just has on any chametz. Amar lei, what do you mean any chametz? He responds, Yihachi apil lechet b'seif ha'olam nami. It means even if it belongs to anyone else, it means someone that's not involved in this Karban Pesach, but it happens to be in the Azara, probably. So Amarle says, no, 1 second, you're taking this too far. Amar Krali Sishchat v'layalin. In the same verse where it says, don't shech the Karban Pesach, when there's chametz, it also says, don't leave the Karban Pesach overnight. It's only the same fellows that would be violating don't leave the Karban Pesach overnight have the prohibition of not to shech the chametz. Okay, so we've limited down to the people of this group. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says if that's the case, once you've extended it like that, you said that we're talking about anyone that would violate leaving the Karban Pesach overnight has the same violation of shechting the Karban Pesach with chametz, and that would also apply to the fellow that offers up the limbs on the altar. He also has a violation. Don't let them sit overnight. So if he has chametz, even though he's not the sheichet, he's not the zayrek, he's just the person that's maybe he's not even involved in the group, maybe he's not part of the group, that's going to eat this. But nevertheless, if he has chametz, because he is included in don't let it stay overnight, he has to have it burnt before morning. So he also violates the law if he owns chametz. Tiny Kavasei Rav Papa. There's a brisa that supports Rav Papa. Someone shechts the Karban Pesach, and there's chametz there, he violates the negative prohibition of don't shech the Karban Pesach together with chametz. When do we say that? That's if the sheichet has it, or the zayrek is one that sprinkles the blood, or one of the people that are registered on the Karban Pesach own chametz. But if anyone else in the world has chametz, that doesn't matter. The sheichet, the zayrek, and the makter are the ones that are chayev. It's a little strange that now we threw in the makdir into that when we didn't have that before. You notice that we just threw in one more person that we didn't mention at the beginning. The Gemara is going to challenge that a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that when you write like a contract or something. There's like a summary at the end. You're not supposed to add in extra things. It's supposed to be a summary of what you put before. What happens if you do? I don't know. But here we sort of like said what we're all the laws, and then we say, well, it doesn't matter if it's the sheikh or the zarek, and we throw in a new detail there. But if someone does malik on a bird, now, if you remember in the Mishnah, we had a discussion if this law applies also to the carbon tamid. Rabbi Yehuda said yes. The Tanna Kama said no. Reb Shimon possibly agrees with Rabbi Yehuda. He does agree with Rabbi Yehuda. He just doesn't agree with Rabbi Yehuda on Erev Pesach. He agreed with Rabbi Yehuda on Pesach itself that other sacrifices would have the same prohibition of don't shech them when chametz exists. What about a bird? We do malik on a bird. Now, we're using a bird here as an example because if you remember, we had a discussion about someone that was tameh and he brought the carbon pesach, but he didn't bring his sacrifices that would allow him to eat the carbon pesach because he went to the mikveh, but he still needed those sacrifices. Until he brought those sacrifices, he couldn't eat the carbon pesach. So he brings those. That was an exception where you're able to bring sacrifices after the carbon tamid. I don't know if you're allowed to lachatchila, but if you did, it helped him. Remember, because he needed, even after the carbon tamid, he needed it for the eating of the carbon pesach, which is that night. You're allowed to bring the carbon pesach after the carbon tamid. Those sacrifices called his kapara sacrifices. He was a mechusar kapara. He was allowed to do that. So we're talking about those birds that probably were the sacrifices that would allow him to eat the carbon pesach. What about if he's moilek the oif bar basar and there's chametz? He doesn't violate it. Why? Because Reb Shimon holds that on the time when the carbon pesach is being brought, the violation of shechting a carbon together with chametz is only the carbon pesach. When the carbon pesach is not being brought, that means once Yom Tov begins, then it applies to the other sacrifices. The Gemara says, 1 second, we have a contradiction or a minhi. So when shechs the carbon pesach and there's chametz there, it's a violation of leisishchet al chametz damasiv. Okay, so far so good. So far there's no contradiction. Rabbi Yehuda Imer afatamid. Rabbi Yehuda says also the tamid. Okay, that's not a problem. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Amrulai, but they said to Rabbi Yehuda, la yamar al bepesach bilbad. They only said this about a carbon pesach. When do we say that it's a problem? If the sheichet, the zayrek, this one that sprinkles the blood, or someone from the chabura, one of the group that's registered on eating this, has the chametz. If anyone else has it, it's no problem. So far, no contradiction. The sheichet, the zayrek, and the mailek, the one that does malika, and the one that sprinkles the blood is chayiv. That's a contradiction. In the last price, you didn't say, you said not mailek. Here we're saying mailek is chayiv. The one that brings this extra bird, or the one that sprinkles the blood is chayiv. But if someone brings a carbon mincha and he does kmitza on the carbon mincha, and he owns chametz, he doesn't violate it. Now it goes on. Hamakter esei murim, someone that offers up imurim, doesn't violate it. Double contradiction. We had a contradiction on Malika. We have a contradiction on the maktir. We brought a brisa before to say that Rav Papa says that the maktir is also violating the law of not to shech the chametz. Why? Because he's also included in don't let it stay overnight. And we brought a brisa that supports that. Now we have a second brisa that says that he's exempt. The Gemara says over here, we're on Samach Dalet. Kasha malika, kasha aktara. It's a double contradiction. The Gemara says, "One second. You make a contradiction between two brises. The brise itself is self-contradictory. Diktani lo yamar ala b'Pesach bilvad. V'adatani echad hashechet v'echad hazerik v'echad hamelech v'echad hamasa. There's a problem. If you look at the second brisa said that there's a machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're not allowed to shech the carbon tamid either. If you also can't shech the carbon tamid together with tamid. Comes along the sages and respond to him. Oh no, not the carbon tamid. It's only about a carbon pesach. And then they go on to say, and it applies to if someone is malik as well. Now there's no malika on a carbon pesach. Malika is the way of sacrificing a bird. You can't do malika on an animal. So they said it's only on the carbon pesach, not on the tamid. And then they continue to say applies to the bird. The Gemara says, well, we have a way of answering that. Elahavaha Reb Shimon. We're talking about that it's the opinion of Reb Shimon. Malika like kasha. Why is there no problem? Why is there no contradiction? Because kan bar basa kan b'chel shamayim. You know that Reb Shimon agrees that it applies to other sacrifices, just not on Erev Pesach. So when it says Malika, it's talking about not on Erev Pesach. Naftali, I'm just going to try to finish to the Mishnah. That's all right. I don't have school today, so give me a little bit extra time. In both of them is the opinion of Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon has this has this leeway, has this wiggle room. We can. He does hold that it doesn't apply to the carbon tamid on Erev Pesach, but other sacrifices that are brought on Pesach, it does apply. Reb Shimon held that the rule of not sacrificing a sacrifice together with chametz has two different meanings. On Erev Pesach, it means don't sacrifice the carbon Pesach, and on Pesach, it means don't sacrifice any other sacrifice. We've resolved the problem. When it says Malika, it's referring to on Pesach. Haktara nami like kasha. What about, you said the one that was bringing up the limbs, that was a contradiction. It says Tanayi, that's a machlekes. It depends if we compare haktara to the shchita. Now, it says leisishchat al chametz. Leisishchat al chametz. Does that apply to the haktara as well? When it says don't, it says clearly the prohibition is don't shech. So one person says, well, it applies to the sprinkling of the blood, to the zayrik, so it also applies to the makter. Another one says, no, you only extend it to the zayrik, but it doesn't apply to the one that's offering or burning it on the altar. Rabbi Yehuda says it also applies to slaughtering the carbon tamid. You can't have chametz, and if the one that slaughters the carbon tamid has chametz, it's a prohibition. My time with the Rabbi Yehuda Amalach zivchi zevach hamiyuchad li. My sacrifice, which is also referring to the carbon tamid, my new tamid. That's referring to the carbon tamid. That extra emphasis there. My sacrifice, hamiyuchadli. That's the carbon tamid that's brought for Hashem. Reb Shimon Oimer Pesach Bar Basa. Reb Shimon says it depends. On Erev Pesach, it's only referring to the carbon Pesach. On Pesach itself, it's referring to other sacrifices. My time with the Reb Shimon. What's the reason for Reb Shimon? He says, "Diksiv zivchi trei zimni." It says the pasuk twice. It says it twice. Kari bei zevach zivchai. It means a plural. I put the extra yud there. Zivchi means my sacrifice. Zivchai means my sacrifices. L'may hilchasa. What's it coming to teach me? Palgino. For what reason did it divide it up into two separate statements and say zivchi? L'meimar is coming to teach us it's coming to tell me that when I have the carbon pesach, then you're only chayev for the carbon pesach with chametz. But when I don't have the carbon pesach, which means the rest of pesach, then I'm chayav on other sacrifices as well. We said that if the sacrifice is valid, then it's a violation. If the sacrifice is not valid, then it's not a violation. What's the reason why it's not valid? Okay, we have to go back. We said like this: if you shecht a carbon Pesach, not on Pesach, what is that sacrifice? Is it automatically a shlamim? Or is it you have to have intention that it becomes a shlamim? So the Gemara says, based on the Mishnah, it said, if I shecht it as a carbon Pesach, then it's considered an invalid, then it's considered invalid, and I'm exempt. But if I shecht it as a shlamim, then it's considered valid. So the Gemara's medayah. It says, time of the shalei l'shmai. What made it valid was because you intended for it to be a shlamim. Hastama, but if you have no intention, and I shech the carbon Pesach any other time of the year, it says pater, then I would be exempt. Why? Because it's not valid. Amai, why is it not valid? Pesach b'shayim eisasana shlamim havi. That's a regular shlamim. It's the default. A carbon Pesach on Erev Pesach is a carbon Pesach. But if I shecht it any other time of the year without any intention, the default is that it's a shlamim. A taida is a type of shlamim. Yeah.
Said that was a real that if it's that covered after the shlamim in the time of the year, that it's
yeah, that's clear. That's no problem.
Oh,
that's the Gemara's question. Why do you have to say it's a shlamim? It should be a shlamim automatically. That's the Gemara's question. Shamat minei, we see from this, Pesach b'shayim eisashana boyakira. It must mean that the Pesach, the rest of the year, needs to be uprooted. Uprooted means that you have to clearly have intention that it's not a carbon Pesach. Reb Chia bar Gamda, Nizrukum Pichabura, Reb Chia bar Gamda says that this was expressed by the group when they learned this. Here it's a special case. Why over here does it need to be uprooted? That's because the owners were actually tamei on Pesach Rishon, and they were going to use this carbon Pesach for Pesach Sheni. So over here, not on Pesach, it still has a status of a carbon Pesach. Normally, it doesn't have a status of a carbon Pesach. It's by default a shlamim. But over here, they were still holding on to it as a carbon Pesach, so it needs to be uprooted.